The storm had battered the mountain range since early morning, turning the narrow trail into a ribbon of ice and the rocky outcroppings into deadly traps. Wind screamed through the canyons in long, merciless gusts, slapping Boon Cartwright's face with icy fingers. He pulled the collar of his leather coat higher, tightened the reins, and tried to keep his horse from spooking as they trudged through snowdrifts already reaching his knees. He'd been riding for 3 straight days, hoping to reach the trading post before the storm turned into a scythe of death. But in that brutal landscape where life and death were separated by a single misstep, he stumbled upon something that would change his life forever: a girl nearly frozen into the snow. At first he thought she might be some animal curled up to escape the wind, but as he drew closer, the outline became unmistakably human. A young woman, maybe no more than 20, wrapped in a thin deerskin dress, so flimsy it hurt to look at her. Her body was curled in on itself. Her lips had turned blue, and her hands trembled so violently they seemed no longer alive, only fading towards silence. Her eyes fluttered open when Boon crouched beside her, not with fear and not with hope, but with the look of someone who had already accepted her fate. And yet, in those eyes, Boon saw something that struck him like a blade to the chest, a quiet resilience, a fragile beauty clinging to life's last edge. Without hesitation, Boon pulled his thickest blanket from the saddle, a hand-woven wool quilt his grandmother had made before she passed the one item he'd carried for years, like a sacred charm, across the cruel western plains. Without it, cold nights on the trail could be unbearable. But as he looked down at the girl, Boon knew he couldn't just ride on. Gently he wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, and for the first time her trembling eased slightly beneath the warmth. She stared at him as if a white man offering kindness was something beyond belief. Her eyes locked with his again, and for a moment something wordless passed between them, fleeting but real between two souls from worlds that had long been taught to mistrust each other. They didn't speak much. Boon guided her behind a boulder for shelter, started a fire, and offered what little trail rations he had left. She pointed to herself and said Ayana, the name lilting through the wind like a song of sorrow. She ate slowly, never taking her eyes off him. He could feel her memorizing the lines of his face, not with suspicion, but with the solemn expression of someone who owed a debt, too great for words. At sunrise, Boon readied his horse. The girl stood gently folding the blanket and offering it back to him with both hands. But he shook his head. "Keep it," he said, knowing she wouldn't understand the words, but hoping she'd understand the meaning. Her eyes widened, not just in surprise, but something closer to alarm. She began speaking rapidly in Apache, pointing to the blanket, then to him. Her voice rose in urgency, maybe even fear. But Boon only gave her a calm smile, mounted up, and rode away, thinking he'd done a good thing. A simple act of kindness. It wasn't until he reached the trading post, heard drums echoing through the ridges, and felt the unseen eyes of Apache warriors watching from the trees that Boon began to understand. What he'd thought was compassion might have meant something entirely different. In a world where cultural symbols speak louder than words and carry weight far deeper than casual gestures, the blanket he had given wasn't just warmth. It was a promise, a marital offering, a sacred gesture of lifelong intent. And he, an outsider, had unknowingly stepped into that binding tradition through the most innocent act imaginable. As the low thunder of drums rolled through the canyons like the heartbeat of ancient land, Boon felt the story slipping out of his hands. What had begun in pure-hearted instinct was now tangled in a web of meaning he couldn't control. And worse, he couldn't explain it away with logic or erase it with a gun. No bullet could shoot down a misunderstanding this deeply rooted in identity, culture, and trust. For the first time, Boon felt something colder than the snowstorm he'd just escaped, the helplessness of realizing that good intentions can still carry a price when they collide with a world you don't fully understand. Boon Cartwright had never imagined a blanket could become a chain, but as he turned away from Ayana in the misty mountain dawn, his heart felt light, believing he had just done a good deed. At that very moment, however, he had unknowingly stepped into the center of a conflict won without gunfire, without shouting, but with the very real danger of igniting a different kind of storm, one between people and the meanings they carried. That evening, sitting in the sweltering warmth of the trading post, cradling a tin cup of black coffee, and listening to the others trade stories about Apache, like distant thunder, Boon felt something stir uneasily inside him. Something wasn't right. Ayana's eyes, as she had watched him ride away, hadn't held only gratitude. They had tried to tell him something. And then, from out of the thick fog rolling over the hills like the breath of the earth itself, the drums began to beat. It wasn't a war drum, nor a call for peace. It was something older, something deeper. A voice from the bones of the land reminding Boon that he had crossed a threshold. And beyond that threshold was a world where every gesture bore weight, where every silence echoed with ancestral memory. When 7 riders appeared at the trail's edge, they didn't draw weapons. They didn't shout. They simply waited, their presence a question. "What do you have to say for yourself?" Then Ayana emerged from behind them, no longer the freezing girl huddled in the snow. She stood tall, solemn, the blanket Boon had given her, now draped across her shoulders like something sacred. And in that moment, Boon understood. There was no mistaking it anymore. In their eyes, he had married her. "You made a declaration," Ayana said, her voice calm and firm, not accusing. "To the ancestors, to the spirits of the land, that you would protect me for the rest of your life. When a man gives a woman his blanket to save her, it is not just kindness. It is a bond." Boon felt like the ground had been pulled from under him. In his world, a good deed was just that. A good deed. You helped someone and then went your way. But here, under the eyes of people who had survived on tradition for generations, every action was a vow. Every silence was a witness. "That wasn't my intention," Boon rasped. "I just didn't want her to die." But even as he said it, he knew it was useless. Because in this place, words were meaningless if your actions had already spoken for you. An elder stepped forward, calm but formidable in his stillness. Boon didn't need translation to feel the weight of what he was about to say. When Ayana spoke, her voice had a solemn edge. "If the promise is denied," she said, translating, "my family's honor is stained, and only blood can cleanse that shame." For the first time since becoming a cowboy, Boon felt his gun useless. Bullets couldn't untangle promises. They couldn't erase misunderstandings built from centuries of hurt and history. And running that would only confirm his guilt. But staying, what did that mean? A marriage he never intended. A lifetime tied to someone he barely knew inside a community he'd always been taught to fear. He looked at Ayana. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. But in her eyes there was something that pierced him deeper than any knife. She was wondering if this was all her fault, for surviving, for trusting his kindness, for misunderstanding. No. Boon couldn't let her carry that burden alone. "Is there another way?" he asked softly. "Some kind of trial or ceremony to prove I didn't come here to deceive?" The elder looked at him a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice low, steady, like a winter stream flowing under ice. He says, Ayana translated, "Only a warrior asks for a trial instead of running away. If you're willing to come to our village and face what lies ahead, he will give you a chance to understand and to choose for real." That last part, "to choose for real," struck something deep in Boon, because maybe all this time he'd thought he was making choices, but he'd never truly understood what was at stake. Now finally he would. He would walk into their world, not as a stranger lost in a foreign land, but as a man ready to own the consequences of what he had done. They began riding deeper into the mountains, just as the sun crested the pines, casting long golden beams across the red dirt trail, like holy fingers pointing the way. Boon followed the Apache riders in silence, each hoofbeat echoing off the canyon walls like a bell tolling for a mistake he hadn't meant to make, but couldn't take back. Ayana rode beside him, saying nothing, but every time she glanced his way, her eyes held something that felt eerily close to trust, fragile as mist, but real. They didn't rush him, didn't bind or guard him. But Boon understood he wasn't being taken. He was being tested. From the moment he had asked for another chance, the path of his fate had shifted. He was no longer just a man who had blundered into sacred ground. He had become someone asking for the right to make it right. And that changed everything. The heaviness in his chest, once guilt, was now responsibility. No one forced him to follow. But he rode on every mile, every breath a choice he made with open eyes. The village emerged like a secret, unraveling from the land itself, hidden between two towering cliffs beside a stream that sang like a memory. Homes built of wood hide and stone rested beneath the trees. Children ran through the dust. Smoke rose from cook fires. But everything stopped the moment Boon appeared. Eyes turned to watch him, not full of hatred, but wary questioning. He wasn't just a stranger. He was a man who had touched something sacred without understanding its meaning. In the village center, near a fire that burned low and steady, the elder waited. He was a man whose eyes looked like they had seen centuries. He raised one hand for silence, then placed 3 objects on the ground before him: a thick weathered rope, a carved wooden block filled with ancient symbols, and a small leather pouch that clicked softly with the sound of bone inside. 3 trials. Ayana said, her voice no louder than the wind through the trees, but heavy as a mountain. Strength, wisdom, and sacrifice. If you complete them, you may stand among us as a man who chose to belong, not one who stumbled into chaos. If you fail, you know what that means. Boon nodded. His heart didn't race. It beat slowly like a vow being spoken inside his chest. He wasn't a warrior, he wasn't a scholar or a preacher, but he had something he had never dared call his own, before a heart that took responsibility. We begin with strength, the elder said, and Ayana translated, though Boon barely needed it. The old man pointed to the cliff towering behind the village. 60 feet high near the summit rested an eagle's nest. A thick rope hung down the rock face, swaying in the breeze like a dare carved in sky. You must climb, Ayana said. Take a feather from the nest and come down safely. If not, you've failed. Boon shrugged off his coat, removed his hat, and wrapped his hands around the coarse rope, eyes locked on the heights above. Below, the children had stopped playing. The elders fell into still silence. Karuk, the young man who wanted Ayana for himself, stood with arms crossed, waiting, almost willing him to fall. Boon started to climb. At first it was easier than expected. Years of ranch work had built muscle memory in his shoulders, strength in his forearms. His hands hardened by reins and rope, gripped with purpose. But as he ascended, the wind stiffened. The rock turned colder. His palms began to bleed from the chafing rope. Halfway up, a section of rock gave way beneath his boots, and he swung out into open air. Gasps rose from below. He thought he heard Ayana cry out. His shoulders burned under his full weight, arms trembling, blood slickening his grip. But he didn't let go. Not this time. He climbed again, inch by inch, muscles on fire, sweat stinging open wounds. And then at last, he reached the nest. A massive eagle exploded from the branch's wings, wide beak snapping inches from his face. Boon ducked just in time. Within the tangled twigs, a single feather rested like it had been waiting for him. He grabbed it and began his descent, slow and shaking, every muscle screaming for rest. When his boots hit the ground, his legs collapsed beneath him, but he raised the feather high. The crowd murmured in disbelief. Even Karuk looked stunned. The elder stepped forward and gave a solemn nod. One trial completed. But as his hand reached for the carved wooden block, the symbol of the next trial, Boon understood it was far from over. And from here on out, strength wouldn't be enough. What he was about to face wasn't just language. It was culture, a worldview, a truth shaped by generations he'd never known. But in that moment when he caught Ayana's gaze, he saw something unexpected: hope. Not because he had proven he was strong, but because he was trying to understand. And sometimes, hope begins there. When Boon stood before the cliff face, no one needed to explain anything further. The rock wall loomed like a vertical slab of the earth, so tall he had to tilt his head all the way back to see the eagle's nest, a dark smudge on the sky where stone met heaven. The rough rope tied to a wooden stake at the base dangled toward the summit like a question that demanded one answer. Do you dare? The elder gave a nod, signaling the start. Boon shrugged off his coat, set his hat by the fire, and gripped the rope with calloused hands. He drew in a deep breath, letting the cold mountain air fill his lungs, then began to climb. At first it went smoothly, his body hardened by years of riding. Roping and wrestling cattle responded on instinct, his hands trained by reins and rope gripped in rhythm. His heels found holds in the stone's uneven face. But past 20 feet his muscles started to burn, then sear. Every pull shot pain down his arms. Below him the rock grew slick with moss and ice. Boon didn't look down. He knew if he did, he'd see the entire village staring up faces small, with distant eyes tracking every move. He'd see the one silently hoping he'd fail. And more than any of that, he'd see Ayana. Not because she doubted him, but because she believed if he fell, it would all end in a way no one wanted. But Boon couldn't fall. Not this time. His palms began to bleed. The rope scraped against his cold, softened skin, leaving red streaks in its wake. His breathing grew labored. His whole body screamed, "Let go. Slide down. It's safer that way." It was survival instinct. But something inside Boon was stronger than that. A need to prove he wasn't just here out of obligation. Not just a lost cowboy among strangers, but a man who would meet their world on its terms, face to face. Just a few feet from the nest, a foothold gave way beneath his boot. The stone cracked loose. Suddenly he was swinging in mid-air, hanging by bloody hands 40 feet above the ground. A cry rang out below, maybe Ayana's. His shoulders strained, his full weight tearing at his grip. He twisted, slammed into the rock wall. Sweat and blood mixed and ran into his mouth, salty and warm. His vision blurred. He almost let go. Just 1 second more and he'd have fallen. But then, he thought of the blanket, of Ayana's face beside the fire, of the elder's eyes, ancient but sharp as a knife. If he let go now, it wouldn't just be failure. It would prove Boon Cartwright never truly belonged here. He gritted his teeth, dug his boot into a narrow crack, and twisted his body back toward the rock. Every movement was a dare to the sky, every pull upward a declaration, "I'm still here." And at last, Boon reached the nest. A massive eagle burst from the branch's wings as wide as a man was tall. It roared past his face, beak snapping inches away. Boon ducked the strike, one hand still gripping the rope. A claw raked across his shoulder, tearing skin. Blood flowed hot and fast, but he didn't retreat. In the middle of the dry twigs and scattered feathers, he spotted a perfect plume, brown gold, clean untouched, like it had been waiting just for him. He grabbed it and started down. The descent was worse than the climb. His body was exhausted. His hands had gone numb. But somehow his will held stubborn as the granite of this land. When his boots hit the ground, his knees buckled. But no one laughed. No one cheered. And in that silence, Boon heard something louder than applause, awe, respect. He raised the eagle feather high arm, shaking and streaked with blood. The elder stepped forward, received the feather with both hands, as if accepting something sacred. He looked at Boon for a long, quiet moment, then gave a single nod. Ayana translated, her voice trembling. "He says the eagle attacked you, but you didn't turn away. You won not through violence, but courage. The first trial is complete." Boon didn't smile. He only bowed his head and gasped for breath. Inside his chest, something warm flickered to life, a fire of knowing. Not that he could survive this, but that he might deserve to. The fire at the center of the village still burned low and steady as the second trial began. Boon sat across from the tribal elder on the other side of the glowing coals. The wound on his shoulder still bled beneath the torn fabric, his arm throbbed like it was burning. But physical pain now whispered in the shadow of something far greater. A trial not of strength, but of the mind. Before him lay a long slab of carved wood cut from the trunk of an ancient tree, its surface covered in strange symbols. The deep, careful carvings weren't decorative. They told a story held meaning. The symbols flowed like waves curled around one another, and all led to a spiral etched at the center. Boon studied it, his heart sinking. Not a single English word, not one familiar image. If this was a riddle, he didn't have the question. If this was a test, he didn't speak the language. Ayana sat beside him, forbidden to help. "This is the trial of wisdom," she whispered. "My grandfather calls it the ancestor stone. The one being tested must understand the message left by those who came before, not with words, but with themselves." Boon glanced around. Once again, the villagers had gathered in a silent circle. Karuk stood across the fire, arms folded, a slight smirk on his lips, convinced that the cowboy who had climbed the cliff wouldn't survive a challenge where muscles were useless. Boon exhaled slowly, his hand brushing the cool, aged wood. The feeling reminded him of the old oak back in Texas, near the house where his father used to carve markings to teach him how to track in the woods. He'd never imagined symbols could someday mean survival, but here they might. He tried to piece things together. The spiral in the center may be a symbol of time, or life itself. Around it were 4 major icons: a bear, an eagle, a snake, and a rounded figure he first thought was a rock, but on closer look resembled a rolled-up blanket. 4 symbols, 4 corners, 4 seasons. The thought struck him like a flicker of lightning through a dark sky. He began to see a pattern. Spring the eagle, because it soars high as life renews. Summer. The bear, the time of strength of hunting and building. Autumn, the snake, a season of shedding. Letting go, changing. Winter, the final icon. The blanket, protection, survival, warmth in the cold. A blanket. That blanket. Boon's heart pounded, not with fear, but recognition. Something familiar was reaching out to him. He who didn't speak Apache or understand their traditions was seeing his own story reflected in the wood. Maybe the ancestors weren't looking for cleverness. Maybe they were looking to see who had lived what the symbols meant. He took a deep breath and stood lifting the wooden slab as if it were sacred. "I don't know this language," he said loud enough for everyone to hear his voice steady in the circle of firelight. "I don't know these exact symbols, but I think I understand what your ancestors are asking." Silence. Ayana's eyes widened, hope and fear dancing together. Boon pointed to each image in turn. "The bear is strength, I used it to climb the cliff. The eagle is vision, I had to face fear to approach it. The snake is change, I've had to shed my old self, my old ways of thinking. But this," he rested his hand on the final symbol, "this is why I'm here, kindness. A blanket, a small act that came with great responsibility." He turned to face the elder. "This riddle doesn't ask what I know. It asks who I am, and I believe I'm the man who chose to keep someone warm, even if it meant going cold himself." Still no one moved. Even Karuk stood silent. The elder stepped forward, eyes deep and dark as canyon stone. He looked long and hard at Boon, then turned to Ayana and spoke in their native tongue. He says, Ayana swallowed, eyes bright with something that looked like tears. He says, "You don't need to know the symbols to understand the soul. You chose the path of the blanket, not the conqueror, but the protector. The second trial is complete." Boon exhaled like he'd released the weight of the whole world from his chest. No applause, no cheers. But this time the elder's nod wasn't just acknowledgement. It was something greater. Recognition. He wasn't a stranger anymore. Not entirely. As the firelight of night flickered across the ancestor stone, now set aside, Boon thought it was nearly over. 2 trials, one of strength, one of mind, were behind him. He had bled. He had thought himself dry, but he had stood tall. The Apache had started to look at him, not just as an outsider. In a few of their eyes there was something close to recognition. But then, the elder stepped forward, carrying a small leather pouch, heavy and discreet, as if it held the weight of Boon's own fate. Ayana quietly took the pouch from his hands and sat beside Boon. She opened it. Inside were small carved bones that shimmered in the firelight, whispering in some forgotten language. The elder drew a handful of them and scattered them on the ground in the center of the circle. The final trial, Ayana said, her voice soft as the mountain wind. Sacrifice. Boon didn't ask what that meant. By the way the people stepped back, by the way the flames seemed to hush in reverence, he knew this would be the reckoning. Not of muscle, not of mind, but of heart. The elder studied the pattern of the bones, silent for a long while, as if reading an ancient law from the earth itself. Then he raised his eyes, steady, through the flicker of firelight. Ayana translated slowly. He says, "You must give up the thing most precious to you. The one thing that if you lose it, you'll never be the same man again. Only by letting it go can you fully step into a new life, not standing between two worlds anymore." A chill ran through Boon. Not from the cold, but because he knew instantly what it was. Or rather, he had always known. He'd just been trying not to face it. The elder gestured to 3 items Boon had carried with him through this entire journey. 1, his gun at his hip, a symbol of survival power defense. 2, his horse Freedom, speed the means to disappear whenever he chose. And 3, a worn photograph tucked in his shirt pocket. The black and white picture of his parents. His father with that chiseled jaw-thick beard and defiant eyes that always dared the world to try him. His mother, soft-faced, sad-eyed, her hand gently resting on her husband's shoulder, like she was holding him back from a storm only she could see. That photo was family. It was home. It was the last tether Boon had to Texas, to his childhood, to the man he used to be. Ayana whispered, "He says a man can live without a weapon, without a horse, but he cannot truly love someone if he's still chained to the past. You cannot begin again until you've let go." Boon stared at the photo. Memories flooded in the dinners by the fire, laughter, the last embrace before the winter fever took his mother. The way his father never said, "I'm proud of you," but always placed a firm hand on his shoulder when Boon did the right thing. "How do I let them go?" Boon murmured, not really asking anyone. But the answer came from the silence, because that was the trial. He knew it then, holding onto the photo wouldn't bring them back. But letting it go meant accepting they were gone, and that he had to move forward, alone, no longer defining himself by the weight of memory. He pulled the photo from his shirt. His hands trembled not from cold, but because his heart was breaking. He looked at Ayana. She didn't plead, didn't push. But in her eyes, Boon saw the thing that steadied him. She didn't need a hero. She needed a man who would choose, who would stay. Boon stepped toward the fire. The night wind howled through the peaks like songs of old ghosts. He knelt, laid the photo onto the glowing coals. "I give up my past," he said, voice low and firm. "I give up memory to make room for new moments. I let my parents go, not to forget them, but to live fully with the one I choose to walk beside." The fire flared. The picture curled, twisted, then turned to ash. In its final breath, his parents' faces vanished into flame. No cheering, no drums, just silence, sacred and final. The elder approached, nodded not as a judge, but as a man welcoming kin. Ayana leaned close, tears streaking her cheeks. He says, "You chose the hardest path, but it is the path of a grown man." Boon didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. For the first time in his life, he had nothing left to hold on to. And because of that, he was finally ready to begin again, with the girl who had brought light to a heart that had known only fog for too long. The sky began to lighten over the valley as the night of sacrifice gave way to morning quiet and still, as if nature itself was holding its breath for something newly born. The fire at the village center had burned low, but within Boon Cartwright, another flame had just been lit. Not the flame of survival, but the fire of a new life taking shape from the ashes he had willingly left behind. The tribal elder, who once regarded Boon with wary eyes, now stood before him with the calm of a man who had witnessed fate change direction. He didn't say much. He simply held out his hands, offering an item wrapped in soft deerskin. Inside was a new garment made of white buckskin, hand-stitched with threads of red and blue. The patterns weren't just decorative, they told the story of Boon's trials. An eagle perched atop a cliff, a spiral representing wisdom, and a flame, the symbol of sacrifice. Ayana stepped forward, gently took the garment from the elder, and placed it over Boon's shoulders with quiet reverence. She didn't need to say anything. Her eyes, warm, deep, and sincere, spoke for her. No longer was it the gaze of a girl indebted to a stranger who'd saved her from a snowstorm. It was the look of a woman accepting her partner, not because of custom, but because of choice. My grandfather says Ayana whispered her voice like wind brushing the prairie. From this day on, you are no longer a guest. You are one of us. Family. From a distance, the sound of drums rose, not the war drums Boon once feared, but the rhythm of a wedding. The Apache community gathered around the fire. One by one, they stepped forward, laying small gifts at the feet of the new couple, a pouch of seeds, a necklace of carved stone, a piece of hand-woven cloth. Each one a blessing, a welcome. There was no preacher, no paperwork, no golden rings like the weddings Boon had seen in western towns. But what they had here was something few other weddings ever held rebirth. Boon stood tall in his new robe while the old blanket, his grandmother's handmade quilt, was draped across both him and Ayana. That same blanket had once marked the line between life and death during a winter storm. Now it became the bridge between two worlds, between a white man and an Apache woman, between loneliness and belonging, between past and future. And you know what? Maybe the most important thing wasn't that Boon had passed 3 trials. It was that he chose to stay. He chose to face a belief system he hadn't grown up with instead of running away, like a frightened man. In a country as vast and divided as America, split by race, by history, by the harsh rules of the frontier, Boon's story isn't just the tale of a man marrying an Apache woman. It's a testament to the best of the American spirit, the freedom to choose the path you believe is right, even if it leads you to the most unfamiliar place imaginable. So now, I want to ask you, the one hearing this story, what do you think about Boon's choice? Would you have the courage to give up everything you once believed made you, in order to step into a world completely foreign, just for a promise, a look, or a blanket shared in a storm? You might say he was reckless, but I say he made the hardest choice a man can ever make, to let go of fear, in order to belong to something greater than himself. If you support Boon's decision, leave a comment. Write, "I choose to stay like Boon." If you believe like I do that sometimes love and commitment are what truly make a man, not the gun on his hip, not the horse under his boots, but the heart he chooses to carry in his hands. Because a man's real journey doesn't end at the wedding. It begins the moment he chooses to belong to someone else.